When the Super Nintendo launched in 1991, I was expecting it to really hammer the Sega Genesis across the board, technology-wise. On paper, Nintendo's new console had vastly superior color capabilities, a sound chip that could mimic real instruments, and it had a massive amount of third-party support. The simple truth was, Nintendo's 16-bit Titan was 2 years newer and had the software support to take advantage of it. Despite all that, I was happy to see the war was not lost for Sega's 16-bit powerhouse. The Genesis had an extremely potent CPU, a graphics chip that could produce sharp, well-detailed sprites and backgrounds, and when you had a developer that could make that FM sound chip sing, there was nothing else quite like it. I recently did an episode talking about some 16-bit releases that I preferred on the Super Nintendo, and now we're gonna do the same with games I'd much rather play on the Sega Genesis. For a bit of clarity, this isn't about the games being identical in order to compare them, but rather which versions of the game I thought were better, even if they were completely different. It's more about what was available for these two machines and how they fared against one another. I'd also like to stress this is all in good fun, so keep a level head and share your own thoughtful opinions in the comments. I hope you guys enjoy better on the Sega Genesis. First up is Desert Strike from Electronic Arts, the 1992 helicopter flight combat game that plays and sounds better on the Genesis by quite a stretch. I always liked this game because it was set in an open environment where you could explore at will as long as you kept refueled and didn't get shot out the sky. You could also find extra weapons in the field to outfit your Super Apache copter. On Genesis, the gameplay feels more responsive, it feels faster, the visuals are sharper thanks to a higher resolution, and frankly, the FM music and sound effects fit the game like a glove. Truth be told, many of Electronic Arts games between the two systems are like this, and I could fill up the entire episode with just their offerings. This game is mostly the same between the two versions content-wise, so the advantages on the Genesis really make a difference to me. If you've never played it, you're gonna want to fire it up first on Sega's machine. I got another Electronic Arts game series to add to the list, but I promise we'll move on after that. The John Madden football games all played better on the Sega Genesis, especially when it came to the first 3 or 4 years of the series, but ultimately, I mean all of them. They were faster and more responsive across the board. The Super Nintendo versions would sometimes try to add Mode 7 scaling field effects to stand out, but I think this actually hurt things in the end because it always made things move and zoom in a weird way. Madden on the Genesis would play around with new animations and redrawn sprites year to year, but they really seemed more focused on the gameplay, and it paid off again and again. There was a reason the Genesis was known for its sports games, and Madden was a big part of that. When it comes to the raw playability of these games, the Genesis wins hands down every single time. In late 1995, the Genesis and Super Nintendo got a technical marvel in Toy Story from Traveler's Tales. There are so many really cool effects here, from the almost three-dimensional background scrolling all the way to the huge pre-rendered sprites. Pound for pound, the Super Nintendo version has more on-screen color, so it's slightly more pleasant to the eye, but the Genesis more than holds its own in overall visual polish. What makes me prefer the Genesis release is its content changes, gameplay, and additions. First up is the addition of an extra stage towards the end. This level is called Daytona and has Woody racing down a Superscaler-inspired track, collecting power cells in order to make it to the end. It looks great and runs incredibly smooth, a technically impressive showpiece if you will. I also preferred the first-person stage on the Genesis. It runs faster, the screen is larger, and it's easier to navigate. I also thought the Genesis version had more responsive gameplay overall, and in this one, that's really important, because the game is utterly unforgiving the deeper you get into it. No kidding, and it's not just because of the stage design, it's also because the sprites are so damn large, and the hitboxes are a bit suspect. Every advantage is an important one, and I always was able to get further in the Genesis game because it just felt so much better when moving Woody around. Finally, I'd like to point out that this is one of those games that has been confirmed by the developer to use the shadow and highlight feature on the Genesis, resulting in more colors on screen than you typically saw of the hardware. Check it out in the cinematics to see it in action. Hello? In 1993, Mortal Kombat came home to the Genesis and the Super Nintendo thanks to Acclaim. The thing is that they were developed by different teams. The Sega release was done by Probe Entertainment, while the Super Nintendo was a product of Sculptured Software. This resulted in two wildly different experiences, further complicated by Nintendo's policy of censorship at the time. These games have always been about the hyper-violence it portrays, and the Genesis had it accurate to the arcade. When you landed a perfect shot, blood would fly. When the match ended, you could score vicious fatalities like decapitations and burning someone to a crisp. I also preferred the way the Genesis edition played. It was so much more responsive, and it made a huge difference in multiplayer. While I choose the Genesis edition every time in regards to playability, it's not quite the clean sweep some make it out to be. What the Super Nintendo lacks in blood, gore, and pinpoint gameplay, it almost makes up for with a knockout visual and audio presentation. Seeing the Super Nintendo game in action really made you wish Sculptured Software had done the Sega release as well. It's got a bunch more voice samples that sound great, and the visuals are on a completely different level. As good as it looks, however, visuals do not overcome the other issues, and this game will be eternally better on Sega's machine.
Scorpion wins. Get over here! Excellent. Finish him.
Captain America and the Avengers was a great Data East arcade beat-em-up released in 1991. That following year, the Genesis got a solid port of it thanks to Opera House and Intelligent System Corporation. From what I can tell, you get most of the arcade's voice samples. The visuals are fairly accurate outside of some mild loss in detail, and the soundtrack is actually better. Thanks to a custom FM sound driver created by Hitoshi Sakamoto, this is one of those cases where the Genesis sound hardware is doing great work. When the Super Nintendo edition came along in 1993, Real-Time Associates was at the helm, and they did a less than stellar job. They ended up messing with the story, cut the voice work, pumped out a low-effort soundtrack and under-delivered on the graphics. It's not bad, it's just not the same as the Genesis, and if you enjoyed the arcade, that's gonna make a big difference. To sum up, I wanted something as close to that arcade as possible, and the Genesis gets the job done, and then some, with that kick-ass soundtrack. Robocop vs. Terminator is the first game on our list that were very different on the two platforms, despite the name. It was a series of run-and-gun platformers where you played Robocop as he dealt with the rise of Skynet. On the Super Nintendo, it was brighter, more inspired by the original comic book, and didn't have any major gore. On the Genesis, it featured completely different level design. It was chock full of blood and body explosions, and deviated from the comic book quite a bit. The gameplay feels different here as well, coming off faster and more aggressive on the Genesis. Plus it has the expected changes when it comes to sound effects and music. For my money, I always felt the Genesis version was the better game. It used the Dave Perry engine that powered a number of Virgin's games back then, so you know the visuals are fairly good. But once you add in the adrenaline-filled gunplay, the bosses and the gore, it's just a better experience on Sega's console. The great thing here is that since both are different in many ways, they are both worth a look, so don't skip either one of them. A sad tidbit of history is that this was set for release on the Sega CD, something that could have been absolutely epic if done properly. I can only imagine how awesome it would have been to have more detailed story scenes and a CD quality soundtrack with this classic gameplay. Thunder Force 3 is one of the more interesting additions to this list because it originated as a Genesis exclusive. It was done by Technosoft and released in 1990, one of the platform's most incredible shoot-'em-ups in its earlier years. It was lauded by the gaming media for its visuals, music, and fast-paced gameplay. That Genesis version was then ported to the arcade using the Sega System C2 hardware, and was sort of a director's cut that changed a few things around. It took away the stage select, retooled a few of the levels, upgraded the sound effects, and allowed you to continue where you took a death. It was this arcade version that was ported to the Super Nintendo in 1991 as Thunder Spirits. It was handled by Toshiba EMI and would make a few additional changes to some of the stage layouts. As you can imagine, the music hits completely different, and Showdown rears its ugly head quite a bit. On the Genesis, it was just generally a better overall experience for me. I liked the music more, I appreciated the ability to pick your opening stages, and it's faster and more responsive. For a shoot 'em up, that's something I can appreciate, especially with the two games having visuals and content that were so incredibly similar otherwise. Earthworm Gym showed up in 1994 behind a media blitz of commercials, print ads, and magazine hype. Shiny Entertainment was behind development, and it was one of the most popular games the year it was released. This is one of those choices that boils down to the smallest of preferences, because both of these versions look, sound, and play pretty great. The Super Nintendo takes a solid lead in background visuals. You get more details like extra clouds and planets, special effects like lens flares and transparencies, plus a bunch of extra layers of parallax scrolling. Over on the Genesis, you get an extra stage, more sound effects and voices, and a screen resolution that keeps all the sprites in their proper proportions. But that's not all. The low resolution of the Super Nintendo edition makes a real difference here in how much of the screen you can see. And since Earthworm Gym is not an easy game, that makes a difference. I can often look past resolution discrepancies and easily adjust, but in a game like this, I'd just rather have the extra space and reaction time. If you are on Team Genesis for this, you'll also want to check out the Sega CD version, which adds even more extra content. In late 1996, the Genesis and Super Nintendo both received ports of Midway's NBA Hang Time, the arcade follow-up to the NBA Jam titles. A lot of folks out there have no idea how good these games were. The previous NBA Jam ports had been fun games, but Hang Time is on another level entirely. The visuals are so much better, the animation is improved, the player likenesses are there, and it has a new Create-A-Player mode that adds an entirely new dimension to things. Funcom handled development on both platforms, and overall, they did a bang-up job. What separates them is a quirk in the gameplay that gives the edge to the Genesis. On Sega's platform, the dunks are so much more forgiving anywhere near the basket. On the Super Nintendo, there are what seems like zones, where all you're gonna get is a normal shot or a layup. This makes the Genesis game more aggressive, more intense, and ultimately more satisfying. Both of these games are still great, but I prefer the Genesis release over every other home console version, barring the Nintendo 64. The gameplay here is simply perfect.
For two, scores! Passes! Passes! Scores! Scores!
He jams it in. Incredible! He shoots! Boom shakalaka!
In 1991, the arcade shoot-'em-up Raiden came home to the Genesis and Super Nintendo as Raiden Trad. The story behind these games is one of compromise and shortcomings. On the Genesis, the original developer took the helm and did a respectable job recreating the stages and gameplay of the arcade in its meager 8 megabits of ROM. It runs smoothly, the weapons are all there, there's an extra special stage, and it manages to capture some of the arcade's cool background animations. That 8 megabits was still a hell of a compromise though, because the graphics take a large hit in overall detail and color. Unfortunately, the Super Nintendo uses 8 megabits as well, but gets things worse. There it was developed by Micronix, who straight up put in as little effort as possible. They modified the stages, rearranged or removed details, messed with the boss patterns, and changed many of the enemies' attacks. It feels sort of like an alternate version that doesn't get things quite right. This makes the faithfulness of the Genesis release stand out, and I also like the FM music a lot more. Not even the 2-player co-op can save the Super Nintendo version. In 1994, the fighting classic Samurai Showdown was ported to the Genesis and Super Nintendo. This one boils down to something very simple, very basic, and very personal. On the Super Nintendo, the developers at Monolith chose to keep the game zoomed out at all times, making the fighters really small. I disliked this and never could get used to the look and feel. On the Genesis, it was developed by Saurus and System Vision, which took the opposite approach and left the game zoomed in, giving us much larger fighters. Neither console was powerful enough to handle the dynamic zooming feature of the Neo Geo, so a compromise had to be made. I prefer the compromise of the Sega version hands down. Though I have this preference, it's not a clean sweep by any measure. The Super Nintendo sound is better, plus the backgrounds often feature more animation, detail, and a lot more color. It also manages to retain the arcade's opening animation, which is missing from the Genesis. The biggest plus in the Super Nintendo column is the fact Earthquake is still a playable character. The Genesis edition strips him away completely along with his stage. I gotta be honest here, for many of you the Super Nintendo release is probably the winner, but that zoomed out perspective just never sat well with me. It changes the timing and feeling of everything, so it's the Genesis all the way. I saved Street Racer for last because this one is a case of the developer Vivid Image trying to utilize each hardware in its own unique way. The Super Nintendo release is essentially a Mario Kart clone, right down to the Mode 7 style visuals. It's a solid experience if you enjoyed Nintendo's effort, but I much prefer the Mega Drive edition. On Mega Drive, it's much more traditional racer, with longer, faster tracks that are as smooth as can be. I found that to be so much more satisfying than the smaller, bumpier feeling on the Super Nintendo stages. The developer also chose the Chrysalis sound driver for the music on the Mega Drive, really nailing down a very good overall soundtrack. Both these games include some fun multiplayer and additional modes to extend the fun, but where you land on them is likely gonna greatly depend on how you feel about their visuals. Unfortunately, the Mega Drive version never found its way to the United States, so you'll need to deal with other regions if you own a Genesis. There we go, a nice list of games that I felt were better on the Sega Genesis. Just like my Super Nintendo episode, I wanted to really put focus on how different each of us are when it comes to what we value most in our games. Some of us are strictly graphics snobs, looking for color and detail. Others focus heavily on resolution, sound, and even the controller. That's why we get so many differing opinions on these games, and why they end up satisfying all of us in different ways. One person's focus can be utterly meaningless to another, which is why arguing about it is about as pointless as things can get. For me, I enjoy sitting back and seeing the many reasons why these games appeal to all of you. Was it the sound, the graphics, the gameplay, or some other reason you preferred one over another? I'm also considering taking this idea a step further by comparing other systems and moving into different console generations. If any of that interests you, let me know down in the comments what you'd like to see. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.